Welcome to Down and Dirty Hippie, the place where history, culture, and current events collide. If you would like to delve deeper into any of the topics discussed here, please visit our website for full research and resource links.
Today, we're really getting into something fundamental. The president's absolute duty to uphold the Constitution.
Yeah, it sounds simple, maybe, but it's incredibly complex when you dig in.
Exactly. We've gathered a lot of material, legal, historical accounts, looks at the oath itself to really get under the hood of what this means for the U.S. president.
And our goal here is to kind of unpack this for you, quickly but thoroughly. Maybe uncover some things you hadn't thought about. And this idea of presidential fidelity, it's not optional. It's really the bedrock of their legitimacy.
So where do we start with something this big? Our sources all point to one place: the Presidential Oath of Office, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 8.
Mm-hmm. And what's really striking about it, right off the bat, is how unique it is.
Unique how?
Well, it's the only oath where the actual words are spelled out right there in the Constitution. Think about that.
Okay, yeah. So, like, senators or judges, they take an oath, too.
They do. Article 6 says they have to swear to support the Constitution. But Congress decides the exact wording for them. You know, the current version talks about supporting and defending true faith and allegiance.
But the president's oath is specific. I do solemnly swear or affirm. And then the key part: faithfully execute the office of president and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution.
And crucially, they take it before they even start the job.
Right. It's a condition. Like, you can't even be president until you say these words.
Precisely. A conditioned precedent. It's not just ceremony. It's a prerequisite for legitimately wielding any presidential power.
And notice that dual focus you mentioned earlier. It's not just about doing the job, running the office.
No, it's equally about the Constitution itself. Preserve, protect, and defend. Those are strong, active verbs.
Yeah, preserve, like keep it intact, protect, shield it from harm, defend, actively fight for it. It sounds like guardianship.
It really does. Much more active than just support. It implies this ongoing, vigilant stewardship.
Okay, so it lays out this massive responsibility. But here's a question our sources raise. Does the oath itself give the president power to do these things, or does it just state the duty?
The classic debate. The dominant view, especially in legal circles, is that it primarily imposes a duty. It sets the standard, the obligation.
But it doesn't, like, magically grant extra powers not listed elsewhere in Article 2?
Generally, no. The authority to act comes from the specific powers granted in the Constitution. The oath tells the president how they must use those powers faithfully and in defense of the Constitution.
Got it. So the oath is the foundation. Where else does the Constitution talk about these duties?
Well, we stay mostly in Article 2. There are three key parts that work together, sometimes uneasily. The Oath Clause we just discussed, the Take Care Clause in Section 3, and the Vesting Clause back in Section 1.
Okay, let's circle back to the oath for a second. That phrase, "to the best of my ability." What's the significance there? It sounds like an out, almost.
Well, not quite an out. It suggests a standard of diligent effort. You have to try your hardest, use all your capabilities. It doesn't mean you have to be perfect or that you get to decide what the Constitution means all by yourself.
So it acknowledges human limitation, maybe, but demands good faith effort.
Exactly. Some scholars point out that earlier drafts might have implied more independent interpretive power, but the final wording focuses on the effort and diligence.
Okay. Now, you mentioned presidents sometimes acting like the oath itself gave them power. Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about Andrew Jackson and his veto of the Second Bank of the United States. Part of his argument was that his oath required him to judge the bank's constitutionality, regardless of what Congress or the Supreme Court thought.
So he's saying, my oath binds me to my understanding.
Precisely. Lincoln, too, with the suspension of habeas corpus early in the Civil War, before Congress acted, he framed it partly as fulfilling his oath to preserve the nation, and thus the Constitution, during an existential crisis.
That connects to that idea of departmentalism, right? Where each branch thinks it gets to interpret the Constitution for its own purposes.
Exactly. Departmentalism relies heavily on this idea that the oath gives the president and Congress and the judiciary co-equal interpretive authority for their own functions.
But the more standard view is that the oath is mainly about the duty to follow the Constitution as it's understood, often through judicial interpretation.
That's the prevailing view, yes. The oath directs how power is used, ensuring it aligns with the Constitution rather than being a blank check for new powers.
Which then raises the question, what actually counts as violating the oath? Is there a clear line?
That's the tricky part. The Constitution doesn't give us a definition. And since branches can disagree on what the Constitution means.
One branch's fidelity could look like another's violation.
Right. There have been arguments, for instance, about whether a president is bound by their oath to ignore a law they think is unconstitutional.
Versus the duty to execute all laws passed by Congress.
Exactly. But certainly, grabbing power the Constitution doesn't grant could be seen as a violation.
So, if the definition is fuzzy, how is a president held accountable for potentially violating the oath?
It largely falls to political mechanisms. Impeachment is the big one. High crimes and misdemeanors has often been linked to constitutional violations or abuses of power that betray the oath.
And, of course, elections.
Absolutely. Public opinion, political pressure, the prospect of being voted out. Madison and Washington talked about public scrutiny being a key check.
Okay, so the oath is crucial but complex. Let's move to that second clause, the take care clause. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Seems simple enough.
On the surface, yes. It's the core of the president's job as chief executive to make sure Congress's laws get enforced. But even there, you've got wiggle room.
Like the word faithfully. Does that mean follow every letter or just make a reasonable effort?
That's part of the debate. How much discretion does the president have in how they execute the laws? It bumps up against legislative supremacy.
But the really big debate our sources flag is, what counts as the laws? Does it include the Constitution itself?
This is critical. If the laws includes the Constitution, then the Take Care Clause gives the president a direct command to enforce their interpretation of the Constitution. Departmentalists love this argument.
And they link it to the Supremacy Clause in Article 6.
They do. Article 6 says the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land. So they argue the Constitution is a law the president must execute.
Makes some sense, but what's the counterargument?
It's pretty strong, actually, based on the text itself. The Supremacy Clause lists this Constitution and laws made in pursuance thereof separately. Why list them separately if laws already included the Constitution?
Good point. Like saying apples and fruit.
Kind of, yeah. Plus, the Oath Clause specifically mentions preserving the Constitution, separate from the Take Care Clause's focus on the laws. The framers seem to have treated them as distinct duties.
And looking at how law or laws is used elsewhere in the Constitution.
It almost always refers to statutes passed by Congress. Even the drafting history shows the Take Care Clause originally talked about executing national laws.
Okay, so if the laws in the Take Care Clause probably means statutes, not the Constitution, what's the implication?
It significantly weakens the textual basis for saying the president has an independent power derived from the Take Care Clause to interpret and enforce the Constitution autonomously.
It suggests the take care duty is mainly about executing statutes and treaties, while the bigger constitutional guardianship comes from the oath.
Exactly. A sort of dual framework. Faithfully execute the statutes, but also preserve, protect, and defend the overall constitutional structure guided by the oath. This helps explain things like vetoing a bill on constitutional grounds while still executing other laws.
Interesting distinction. Okay, third piece, the vesting clause. The executive power shall be vested in a president. Simple phrase, big fight.
Huge fight. Does that just mean, okay, we're calling the boss the president and here are their listed powers? Or does it grant a whole pool of unenumerated executive power, especially for things like foreign affairs or national security?
The inherent powers argument.
Right. Presidents often invoke this, especially in crises, claiming powers not explicitly listed, but seen as, well, inherently executive.
So how does this connect back to the duties? Does this executive power enable the president to fulfill the oath and take care duties, or are those duties limits on this power?
That's the nub of it. And the Youngstown Steel seizure case is key here. Truman tried to argue inherent executive power plus commander-in-chief power justified seizing the mills.
And the Supreme Court said?
Nope. Justice Black's opinion essentially said presidential power has to stem from Congress or the Constitution itself. The duty to execute the laws passed by Congress actually limits executive power. The president executes laws, doesn't make them, even in emergencies.
So Youngstown really pushed back against a broad reading of the vesting clause as a source of independent power.
It did. It emphasized that the president's core job is executing Congress's laws, constrained by the Constitution. It really highlights how these clauses, oath, take care, vesting, are ambiguous and lead to conflict when presidents try to stretch them.
Okay, so we have these textual foundations, but they're open to interpretation. How does that interpretation actually happen? Our sources talk about presidential views versus judicial review. Let's start with presidents interpreting it themselves.
Well, they have to, right? Every time a
Yeah.
president decides whether a bill is constitutional before signing or vetoing it, or issues an executive order claiming constitutional authority, or nominates a judge, they're interpreting.
Which leads back to departmentalism.
Exactly. The idea that the president isn't bound by what the courts or Congress say the Constitution means, at least when it comes to their own executive functions.
Jefferson, Jackson. They really leaned into this.
They did. Jackson's famous line about his oath binding him to the Constitution as he understands it and not as it is understood by others is pure departmentalism. They ground it in the oath, sometimes take care.
But the dominant alternative is judicial supremacy.
Yes, the idea, really cemented by Marbury v. Madison, that the judiciary, ultimately the Supreme Court, gets the final say on what the Constitution means, and that interpretation binds everyone, including the president.
And the textual support for that is Article 3, judicial power, and the Article 6, supremacy clause, binding judges to the Constitution.
Correct. If the Constitution is supreme law, and courts decide cases under the law, their interpretation of that supreme law must prevail.
So practically speaking, it's a constant tension. Presidents interpret constantly in their actions.
Vetoes, executive orders, nominations, treaties, military actions, how they enforce laws.
But the Supreme Court can potentially step in and say, hold on, that's not constitutionally sound.
That's the push and pull. The real friction happens when a president's interpretation bumps up against established court precedents or clear laws from Congress.
Which brings us back to those landmark cases acting as checks. We mentioned Youngstown. What about U.S. v. Nixon?
It's huge. Watergate, the subpoena for the tapes, Nixon claiming absolute executive privilege.
And the court said,
Unanimously, no.
Right.
They acknowledged a presumptive privilege for confidential advice, but said it wasn't absolute. It had to yield to the needs of the criminal justice system, especially when there weren't specific military or diplomatic secrets involved.
The impact was massive, right? President isn't above the law.
Absolutely. It reinforced judicial review, put limits on executive privilege. It showed that upholding the Constitution meant respecting the rule of law and the judicial process, even for the president.
Yeah.
These cases show the courts playing that vital check role.
Okay, moving to more modern tools presidents use that test these boundaries. Executive orders, for instance.
Right. Directives to agencies, often with the force of law, but their legitimacy depends on having a basis in a statute from Congress or in the president's own constitutional powers.
So an EO that just, say, changes private rights without that backing could be trouble. Like Youngstown again.
It's exactly. We've seen lots of challenges recently to EOs on immigration, environment, federal contracts. Courts sometimes strike them down if they go beyond what Congress allowed, violate rights, or mess with the separation of powers.
There was that example of an EO targeting a specific law firm, Perkins Coie.
Yeah. Courts found that unconstitutional violating equal protection seemed like an attack on the judicial system itself. Other challenges involve EOs trying to dismantle agencies or freeze aid Congress appropriated.
Then there's signing statements. The president signs a law but adds a note saying, here's how I interpret it, and maybe I won't enforce this part.
Super controversial. Critics say it's like an illegal line-item veto, undermining Congress and the duty to faithfully execute the whole law.
Proponents say it's just necessary communication guiding the executive branch on constitutional concerns.
That's the fence. It's another area where the boundaries are constantly being pushed and debated.
And finally, enforcement discretion. The executive branch can't prosecute every single violation of every law, right? They have to prioritize.
Of course. Limited resources mean discretion is necessary, prosecutorial discretion, administrative discretion. It's built into the system.
But when does it become a constitutional problem?
Concerns arise when it shifts from case-by-case decisions to broad public policies of non-enforcement for whole categories. Like saying, we're just not enforcing these immigration laws or these drug laws anymore.
Because that looks like the president suspending or rewriting laws, which is Congress's job.
Precisely. It raises take-care clause and separation of powers issues. Courts are usually deferential to individual decisions, but might step in if it looks like a total abdication of statutory duty or ignores congressional limits.
So a lot of the modern action is happening in this administrative space, constantly redefining faithfully execute and preserve, protect, defend.
Definitely. It's not just about big constitutional showdowns anymore. It's also in the weeds of regulation and enforcement.
Okay, let's pivot to some history. Seeing how presidents actually handled these pressures is really telling. Lincoln and habeas corpus, that's a big one.
Massive. Civil War, the Union survival on the line, D.C. vulnerable, Maryland unstable.
And Lincoln authorizes the military to suspend habeas corpus along key routes, letting them detain people without immediate court review.
His justification was Article 1, Section 9 suspension, allowed in rebellion or invasion for public safety. He argued, especially with Congress out of session, his oath to preserve the Constitution required him to act to save the Union itself.
Even if it meant overriding normal procedures.
Right, but Chief Justice Taney immediately pushed back in Ex parte Merryman, saying only Congress could suspend the writ.
And Lincoln basically ignored Taney at first.
He did, citing necessity, but he later went to Congress and got authorization. It perfectly captures that tension.
Yeah.
Do you violate one part of the Constitution to save the whole? Lincoln clearly thought preserving the Union, the constitutional entity, was the highest duty imposed by his oath.
A real paradox of crisis leadership. Okay, contrast that with Eisenhower and Little Rock. Different kind of crisis.
Totally different. This wasn't about national survival, but enforcing the rule of law, specifically a Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Bard, against state defiance.
Governor Faubus using the National Guard to block integration.
And Eisenhower, after trying to negotiate, sends in the 101st Airborne, federalizes the Arkansas Guard.
His justification was purely about upholding the law.
Explicitly. He called it his inescapable duty under the Take Care Clause and his oath to enforce federal court orders. He said failure would be anarchy. It wasn't about personal policy preference. It was about the constitutional system working.
So a very clear case of enforcing judicial interpretation as part of the presidential duty, linking Take Care and the oath to uphold the judiciary's role.
Exactly. A powerful precedent.
Now, on the flip side, actions seen as challenging norms, Nixon and Watergate.
The textbook example, really. The break-in was just the start. The cover-up involved perjury, obstruction, abuse of agencies like the IRS, illegal surveillance.
It's a direct assault on the rule of law.
Absolutely. His defiance of the subpoena for the tapes, claiming absolute privilege, was a direct challenge to the judicial branch.
And the system pushed back. The Supreme Court ruled against him. Congress moved towards impeachment.
And he resigned. It showed that the checks and balances, while strained, ultimately held. It was a profound failure to faithfully execute or preserve, protect, defend.
And our sources mention modern examples too, those challenged EOs we discussed. Questions about presidents unilaterally withdrawing from treaties Congress ratified, imposing tariffs against trade laws.
Right. These aren't always Watergate-level crises, but they represent ongoing friction over presidential power boundaries. The courts often end up refereeing these disputes, deciding if the president stayed within their constitutional lane.
That table comparing the cases is useful. Lincoln acting in an existential crisis, maybe bending rules to save the system. Eisenhower enforcing the rules against defiance. Truman checked by the courts. Nixon defying the system. Modern EOs getting challenged.
Yeah, it highlights the different contexts. And crucially, the president's attitude towards the constitutional system matters immensely. Compare Eisenhower's deference to the courts with Nixon's defiance.
Okay. So let's try to wrap this up.
Yeah.
The core message seems to be upholding the Constitution is job one for the president.
Absolutely. It's in the oath. It's reinforced by Take Care. It underlies the whole structure. It means respecting the framework, the boundaries, the rule of law.
But it's messy. The text isn't always clear. Crises create immense pressure. Politics is always involved.
True. But that duty, that obligation, is central to the legitimacy of the office and the stability of the whole system.
And the framers knew this would be tough, right? That's why they built in checks and balances, Congress, the courts, impeachment.
They recognized the need to bind executive power, definitely.
So the oath stands as this constant, powerful reminder. Interpretations shift, accountability mechanisms work better or worse at different times, but that basic expectation of fidelity remains.
It's the benchmark.
After all this. Considering these historical moments, Lincoln, Eisenhower, Nixon, others, what single factor do you think is most critical in making sure a president actually sticks to their constitutional oath, especially when things get really tough or contentious?
Yeah, what really keeps that oath meaningful in practice? It's a tough question.